Let me know when I should start. Thank you. Good morning in some parts of the world and good afternoon in other parts of the world. I think there is still some overlap with other panel. Let me know when the issue is fixed. Well, good afternoon again to all of you. It's been a long day at this conference. It's been really interesting. My name is Francesca Spidalieri. I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, where I teach cyber policy. I'm also a fellow at the Kosciuszko Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this panel discussion on mass weaponization software.
Panel na temat masowego zamieniania oprogramowania na broń, czy wykorzystywania jako broni. Jeden z największych zagrożeń w dzisiejszym świecie. Bardzo się cieszę, że mamy tutaj same panie. Można powiedzieć, że globalnie jest to bardzo poważny problem, a również mamy książkę Tak kończy się świat. Nicole tutaj w tej książce mówi o tym szarej strefie, bardzo lukratywnej, która jest, gdzie oprogramowanie jest coraz bardziej wykorzystywane jako broń dla masowych ataków cybernetycznych, ale zaczynamy od Nicole Perlroth, która jest dziennikarką, która poprzez 10 lat pracuje dla New York Timesa w dziedzinie cyberbezpieczeństwa. Mamy Melissa Hathaway, która jest ekspertką w dziedzinie cyberbezpieczeństwa. Była również doświadczynią, jeśli chodzi o cyberbezpieczeństwo w rządzie prezydenta George'a W. Busha i prezydenta Obamy. Mamy również Katie Moussouris, która jest szefową Luta Security. Zarówno rządy, jako organizacje pozarządowe, nierządowe wykorzystują oprogramowanie jako broń w sposób, jaki większość tego nie oczekiwała. Używają, żeby projektować siłę, wpływać na zachowania, wpływać na wybory, penetrowanie w podmiotach rządowych, krytycznych i coraz bardziej manipulować atakami, manipulować w naszej infrastrukturze, sieciach przesyłowych, zaporach wodnych itd. Te systemy mają bardzo wiele obszarów, gdzie można je zaatakować. We wszystkich w sektorze biznesowym, największych firmach, jak również w sektorze publicznym, jak mówi Nicole w swojej książce, w Stanach i wszędzie indziej, my tworzymy słabe miejsca, w które hakerzy mogą uderzyć i wykorzystywać rządy i firmy, żeby je wykorzystać jako narzędzia do dalszych ataków. To wykorzystanie oprogramowania jako broni odgrywa coraz większą rolę w zwiększaniu napięcia światowego, międzynarodowego i to napięcie geopolityczne i wykorzystanie cyberbroni może prowadzić do eskalacji niepokojów i działań wrogich. Przechodzimy do naszych panelistek. Nicole, od dawna pracuje Pani nad hakerami, nad całym tym sektorem i również mówi Pani o tym, o narzędziach hackingowych. Czy może może nam Pani opowiedzieć o początkach tych ataków hakerskich i tych zagrożeń zerodniowych? Dlaczego one są takie niebezpieczne i na temat rynku, na ten temat?
Dziękuję, Francesco. Bardzo się cieszę, że jestem z Państwem. Ja mam dość silny pogłos, niestety.
No, good.
I believe
and I
that's
know
a
Katie's
translator.
here,
I
but
was hearing the same thing. So we have interpreters talking over us, but we are not here. I'm not hearing any echo.
Just want to make sure. So, and I know Katie's here too, but is having camera difficulties, so she can hear us and speak to these questions as well.
Dla mnie to wielki zaszczyt, że mogę wystąpić na tym spotkaniu i wraz z Melisą będziemy mówić też o kwestiach związanych z atakami hakerskimi. Katie i ja uruchomiliśmy wiele projektów, na przykład w Microsoftie, ale też współpracowaliśmy z różnymi startupami i naszym celem jest to, by pozwolić firmom lepiej zabezpieczyć podatności w swoich firmach, tak nie być narażonymi na ataki hakerskie. Teraz od czego się zaczęło? Czym my się zajmujemy? Najmocniej przepraszam, ale jakość dźwięku jest taka, że mamy bardzo silny pogłos i też są dość silne zakłócenia dźwiękowe. W związku z tym tłumaczenie nie zawsze jest możliwe. Będziemy tłumaczyć zawsze wtedy, kiedy to jest możliwe.
That is considered a 0 day, because if Apple finds out about it, they've had 0 days to fix it.
Jest koncepcja zerowego dnia, czyli to jest taka koncepcja, która polega na tym, że możemy wykorzystać podatność zerowego dnia, tak by zlokalizować hakerów. Czyli na przykład należy zapisywać powiadomienia tekstowe, należy rejestrować rozmowy telefoniczne, czyli powinniśmy zadziałać według koncepcji zerowego dnia. I wiemy na przykład, że z tego też mogą korzystać nie tylko organizacje przestępcze, ale wiemy też, że podatność zerodniowa jest wykorzystywana przez instytucje państwowe, przez wywiad, przez organy ścigania i tak dalej. Czyli to jest exploit zero day może być używany na wiele różnych sposobów. I na przykład gdyby Apple, jak się dowiaduje o tym, iż jakieś oprogramowanie jest podatne, no to wówczas opracowuje łatę na to i to powoduje oczywiście dodatkowe koszty, więc należałoby się zastanowić nad tym, w jaki sposób można rozwiązywać dylematy związane z bezpieczeństwem. I my powinniśmy zrozumieć, w jaki sposób rządy na przykład mogły stworzyć nowe środowisko, które zapewnia bezpieczeństwo w taki sposób, by nie łatać systemu bezpieczeństwa ustawicznie. Należy zastanowić się nad ewolucją rynku cyfrowego. Wszystko zaczęło się w latach 90. w okresie pozimnowojennym. Mianowicie wykonawcy w branży wojskowej zrozumieli, że są pewne luki w technologiach, które należy zabezpieczyć. I w związku z tym powstały pewne narzędzia, które zostały sprzedane do Pentagonu. Najmocniej przepraszam, jakość dźwięku jest taka, że tracimy bardzo dużą ilość treści, tłumaczenie nie jest możliwe. Wznowimy tłumaczenie tak szybko, jak tylko to będzie możliwe.
Because there was a large talent pool of computer scientists and people who were familiar with the very technology that American agencies wanted to penetrate. And they realized that instead of just scouring the world's technology for these 0 days and developing their own exploits, why not tap into these programmers in Eastern Europe and elsewhere to buy the raw material, to buy the 0 days, and then they would bring them back to the Beltway and code them into 0-day exploits and bake them in to click and shoot tools for US intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, law enforcement, etc. So that's really how it started. Now, since I've written the book, people have corrected me and said, actually, this was happening in Europe around the same time too, but there's not as clearly documented history because a lot of these 0 days and exploits and tools get rolled into classified programs, which makes it very difficult for these governments to speak to. Now, the problem is that was the 1990s. If we found a 0 day and exploited it in a technology used by Russia or China, there's no harm, no foul to Americans or maybe to our allies because we were using different technology. That is no longer the case. We are all using iPhones and Androids and Schneider Electric software for our industrial factories and the power grid and Siemens. And so when a government finds a hole in that kind of technology and doesn't seek to get it fixed, they are logically leaving their own citizens, their own businesses, their own economy, their own infrastructure vulnerable. And so that is the place we are today, where the United States is not the only government in this game. Like you said, every government, possibly with the exception of Antarctica, is trying to acquire their own surveillance technology. In some cases, that's 0 days in the raw material. In other cases, it's tapping into companies like NSO Group, who can sell them click and shoot surveillance tools. And so everyone is in this game now. And the question is around escalation. As we automate so much of our critical infrastructure, do we really want to be leaving that open and weaponizing it for surveillance programs or in some cases battlefield preparations? And so that's why I think it's very critical that we have these conversations, that we understand the security dilemma inherent to these markets and the moral hazard baked in. And this is something that nobody wants to talk about. I joke that the 0-day market is a little like Fight Club. The first rule is nobody talks about the 0-day market, and the second rule is nobody talks about the 0-day market. So I'm very glad that we're here today talking about the weaponization of software in the 0-day market.
Thank you, Nicole.
Bardzo dziękuję, Nicole.
W
ten oto sposób zrobiliśmy wprowadzenie dzisiejszej dyskusji. Katie, wracamy do Katie. Zgłaszałaś informacje o tych podatnościach na podatność zerodniową, Zero Day. Od jak dawno interesują Cię kwestie związane z podatnością oprogramowania? I też, co można by zrobić w celu zapobiegania powstawaniu takich podatności? Współpracujesz z różnymi organizacjami, z rządami, z Microsoftem, więc niestety nie widzimy Ciebie, ale z miłą chęcią Ciebie wysłuchamy. Bardzo proszę. Niestety nie słyszymy, więc mamy przed sobą jeszcze sporo czasu, ale Katie, jak tylko połączysz się, zgłoś się proszę. Melissa, jesteś osobą, która od wielu lat zajmuje się tymi tematami. Jesteś doradczynią na rzecz różnych administracji i agencji rządowych i instytucje rządowe oczywiście mają różne możliwości, ale dlaczego tak wiele krajów musi tak sporo inwestować w zdolności ofensywne i narzędzia hakerskie? Przy czym takie inwestycje są czynione w sposób otwarty, ale też i ukryty. Na przykład warto spojrzeć na chińską ustawę dotyczącą podatności oprogramowania i nagle okazuje się, że w Chinach jeżeli ktokolwiek stosuje Zero Day, wówczas informacje o zastosowaniu Zero Day powinny być przekazywane odpowiednim instytucjom chińskim. W związku z tym Chiny zdobywają wszelkie informacje pozyskiwane w ten sposób. Wydaje mi się, że niestety ponownie mamy problemy z dźwiękiem, które cały czas ucieka. Obawiamy się, że jakość dźwięku jest na tyle zniekształcona, że tłumaczenie nie jest możliwe. Tłumacze mówią w tym samym czasie, kiedy mówi mówca. Niestety słaba jakość dźwięku uniemożliwia tłumaczenie.
They see it as a national security imperative to have the tools in the arsenal. Now, there's also a whole challenge with the development of the vulnerabilities and selling them that Nicole really articulated well. And I think when you start to look at what China is now incentivizing its researchers and its community to find those 0 days and disclose them to the government, that it's important for probably three things. First is that from a government perspective, they can leverage it to conduct harm against other entities. The second is creating a disclosure policy within China that potentially would make their software products less vulnerable. And the third is that it might have a negative impact because these researchers may want to monetize their knowledge and move to another country. For example, Taiwan. And Taiwan has some of the really good research communities that have disclosed a number of the vulnerabilities that Microsoft is having to address. And Microsoft and SolarWinds and many of our software companies have become a central point of risk for all critical infrastructures. And Katie will be able to talk to Microsoft has had pretty buggy software for 2 decades, and they patch somewhere nearly 100 vulnerabilities a month.
Szanowni Państwo, niestety ze względu na problemy techniczne związane z jakością dźwięku, tłumaczenie tej sesji nie jest możliwe. W związku z tym przerywamy tłumaczenie. Dziękujemy.
Or the industrial manufacturing that all have Schneider Electric, then you start to worry about when those 0 days could really bring down portions of our economy. I'll stop there, and I can answer some of these other questions that you might have for Katie.
Yes, well, again, oh my God!
Oh, she's here.
You're there. I can see you, at least.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear us? Yes, wonderful. I'm leaving the floor to you. Just enlighten us. I'm just so happy to see you. Thank you.
I'm happy to see you all too. I do hear a really big echo though, so if you wouldn't mind all muting.
Yes, we all do,
really
but
great.
don't worry because we don't hear the echo. It's just
Okay.
in your own platform.
Oh,
we all do.
now I
There's
can't
also
hear
an
you.
Interpreter translating.
Can you hear me? Okay, all right. So it's very echoey and very difficult to hold a sentence together with several seconds of echo, but I will do my best. So I think the question that you had for me was how long have I been working on vulnerability disclosure and why did I start the bug bounty programs at Microsoft? And the answer to that question is, it's a little bit complex because I am a hacker. And so as we talk about what hackers do and what they are capable of, this has been not just my career, but the better part of my life. I learned how to hack as a teenager in the late 80s, early 90s, in close proximity to some famous hacking groups called the Cult of the Dead Cow and the Loft in the Boston area. And so what is good for hackers and what is good for the internet at large have been intertwined in my entire life. And I before there was a professional career of being a hacker, I did some work as a Linux developer, so I built empathy for software development and the true effort it takes to build high quality software and maintain it. And I also worked as a systems administrator at MIT, where we were being attacked from all sides. And certainly, I would expect a lot of organizations to worry about their cybersecurity, and especially in all of these supply chain attacks that we've seen. But hardly anybody thinks about academia, and where a lot of our advanced research takes place, they are largely unable to secure themselves. But fast forwarding to your question about why did I start the bug bounty programs at Microsoft, the answer is a little bit more complex. Microsoft didn't want to start bug bounties. They were receiving over 200,000 to 300,000 non-spam email messages a year of people submitting vulnerability reports to secure@microsoft.com for free. And that volume hasn't materially increased or decreased as a result of the bug bounty program, where we are paying people cash rewards in exchange for these vulnerabilities. But what the bug bounty program allowed Microsoft to do was to take the eyeballs that were already looking for vulnerabilities in Microsoft software and direct them to areas that Microsoft wanted to know what the state of the art research was in that area, so they could build better mitigations and defenses into their platform. And they also wanted to get a jump on vulnerabilities that the offense market wasn't particularly interested in yet, but would be very helpful for Microsoft. For example, vulnerabilities in its beta software. So among the first bug bounties of Microsoft were a bounty in the beta period, the very beginning of the beta period of IE11, which offense market buyers are not going to waste their money on a vulnerability in a beta product that isn't even deployed on any attractive targets, and that could go away like this as the beta period ends and a lot of bugs get fixed. So that was a strategic way for us to incorporate hackers' directed eyeballs towards the goals that Microsoft wanted for itself and for its customers. And I'll stop there because I know there's a lot of questions to get to, and you may have met my hacker cat Scappy, who has joined us for this panel.
I've seen him before. It's always a welcome guest as well. Well, if I can just follow up to that again, so you developed the bug bounty program for Microsoft. You've actually developed many other bounty programs for other organizations, the Pentagon and others. But for example, the United States actually has a process in place when either discovers or purchase some of these vulnerability in the black market to decide when to disclose these vulnerabilities to manufacturers. Can you please discuss how the U.S. vulnerability equity process works and why maybe this process should be also updated?
No, that's a great question. So the vulnerability equity process, it's built on the idea that the U.S. government has to have some way of deciding relative risk. So do we hold on to this vulnerability and use it offensively against targets like terrorist networks and lawful targets like that? Or do we give the vulnerability to the vendor to fix and sort of protect the greater good and critical infrastructure? So this is a balancing act, which I've long thought was done with goodwill, but good intent, but in an impossibly darkened view. And why I say that is that from working at Microsoft for 7 years, you get a sense of the ecosystem in the grandest scale that you can sense the internet ecosystem. But you also come across the problem of the vastness of not knowing where your technology is in use necessarily, even if you built the operating system. I mean, for example, Windows in its various forms, dating way, way back to unsupported versions, is still embedded in a lot of IoT devices. Windows XP runs all over the world in all of these devices. And you think, well, if the vulnerability is in a later version of Windows, then maybe it won't be a problem for all these IoT devices. The problem is code reuse. And you can't really tell as a government organization where in the world little bits of code may still be remnant and may still pose an existential threat to critical infrastructure and national security if you keep that vulnerability under wraps. So for me, the main criticism has always been it's good intentions, that the principles by which you guide this decision-making process. However, those intentions, can't really be enacted in a consistent way because of this great vast unknown of reused code and supply chain issues and interdependencies that you may not have visibility to when you're making those decisions. But I do believe the people who are trying to make them, both here and with our partners, the UK government has a very similar process, VEP process, and they also, like the US government, they tend to default towards disclosing to the vendor to get it fixed. It is usually with exception that they hold on to a particular vulnerability, and typically they hold on to it because they have a specific target in mind. So there isn't, sort of a giant stockpile that they hold on to just in case necessarily. It is more like they will err on the side of trying to disclose to the vendor because they do understand that it's very difficult to perform that risk calculus with any real accuracy for any given amount of time.
Thank you. And Nicole, if I can go back to you, since you talk about how governments are actually amassing these capabilities in tradecraft, we don't have to imagine the worst case scenarios. I know the book reads like a thriller, but these are all real stories. Can you talk about even a couple of the watershed events or most destructive attacks that have actually resulted from the sale or the theft of these tools that governments were collecting?
Yeah, and I also would love to hear Melissa's thoughts on this issue because I know that she was very involved in thinking around potential changes to the vulnerability equities process. What I can tell you is that the criteria, first of all, I should just stop and say that the United States and now the United Kingdom and other governments get immense credit for having a vulnerability equities process in place. You can be sure that no one is sitting around a mahogany table in Iran talking about whether to keep or turn over a 0-day in Microsoft Windows to Microsoft or a 0-day in iOS software to Apple. So we do get credit for entertaining those conversations. And the truth is my understanding is that it is more art than science. And what we learned in the real world, because you really don't get that much insight into this process, it's only been through the revelation of major vulnerabilities and accusations that the NSA, for instance, was holding on to them, that administrations have come out with more clarity around the criteria they use, whether to keep or turn over a 0-day for patching. And among the criteria that they cite are things like how widely used is the technology that we have found this 0-day in. If it's more widely used by our own citizens, by our own infrastructure, if our economy is dependent on it, that will bias us in favor of turning over that 0-day for patching. There are other considerations such as what would be the damage to our relationship with industry, with companies like Microsoft, if it were to get out that we had held on to a major 0-day in Microsoft Windows. What would the damage be if this 0-day got its way into the wrong hand? And this was always the moral hazard and the security dilemma that fascinated me and that I was fixated on and why I wrote this book. But I started writing this book around 2014, and what I never expected to happen was the worst case scenario. I never even let my imagination go to this place of what if the NSA's own stockpile of the 0-days they have held on to get out? I never even thought that was possible. And that is what happened over a period of 2016 to 2017. Someone, we still don't know who they are, the latest thing, insider at the NSA itself, started showing up on Twitter. They called themselves the shadow brokers, and they claimed to have access to some of the NSA's best kept tools and capabilities. And lo and behold, over a period between 2016 and 2017, they started dribbling these out. And sometime in the spring of 2017, the NSA quietly tipped off Microsoft to a flaw in some of its technology, Microsoft Windows. And a month later, we saw the shadow brokers drop the 0 days that ostensibly led them to make that decision quietly by tipping off Microsoft. And what they had done with shadow brokers was dump a 0 day exploit that the NSA had used and considered one of the most precious tools in their arsenal, according to people I've interviewed online. And very quickly, North Korea picked up that 0 day and bolted it onto some ransomware and launched what became known as the WannaCry attack. Fortunately, they were sloppy, and a hacker in the UK was able to neutralize the attack pretty quickly. But a month later, Russia picked up that same 0 day exploit and used it in the NotPetya attack that Melissa referenced earlier and that you referenced earlier, Francesca. And that became one of the most destructive and arguably the costliest cyber attacks that we've ever seen. This was an attack where Russia used one of the NSA's stolen 0 days in an attack aimed at Ukraine, in what they thought was a precision attack, but it ended up having massive collateral damage and hit many businesses that even had a single employee working remotely from Ukraine. It cost Pfizer $400 million in damages. It hit Merck. Merck had to actually tap into the CDC's emergency stockpiles of vaccines that year. It hit Mondelez. It hit Cadbury egg chocolate factories in Tasmania. It really showed the world and governments just how inextricably linked we are now because of this software and because we're so dependent on these systems. But what it also did to the discussion around vulnerability equities was it showed that the criteria we said we held ourselves to, how widely used is this software? How destructive would it be if this capability got out? And we said we were holding ourselves to these criteria. When we looked at that single 0 day that got dumped online and picked up by North Korea and picked up by Russia, you see that all of that criteria was never actually taken into serious consideration because the value for counterintelligence and counterterrorism that single 0 day had for U.S. intelligence agencies was taken as prioritized over everything else. The criteria didn't matter because it held uh, such valuable intelligence gathering value. And so what it exposed was that we can say we have this criteria all day, but if someone finds a 0 day that could be used for counterintelligence, that will still, in many cases, be taken into consideration, and that 0 day will not be released in it could in a country's hand or series hand. The landscape here is changing. These conversations around the vulnerability equities process used to happen a little bit in a bubble, a little bit of these were hypotheticals. What if this got out? What if an adversary used them? But these aren't hypotheticals anymore. And as you mentioned earlier, in China, they now clearly see the value of these 0 days because they're telling their hackers and security experts and programmers, if you find a 0 day, you can't go demonstrate it at a Western hacking competition or conference anymore. You need to give us right of first refusal. They actually shut down one of the popular reporting databases for vulnerabilities and arrested its hero at one point. So they are clearly telling their own community, you give these to the state. In some ways, there's no market. They have no choice. We do have a choice here. We do operate in a free market economy and we can buy these things. But I think that has to factor into the vulnerability equities process now, too. These are not hypotheticals. Other countries see the intelligence value in these flaws in code, and it's now time to factor that into our thinking. And also, on a broader scale, think about how we are vetting the code that we are using for some of our most safety critical systems like the power grid, like transportation, like weapon systems and nuclear plants, et cetera.
Thank you. And before we move on to the next set of questions, I do want to give you, Melissa, the chance to respond both on the vulnerability equity process and how we might want to be updated, restructured, but also again on how these growing cyber arm race and the amassing of these capabilities plays out in the geopolitics around the world.
Well, I agree with what Nicole said. But vulnerability equities need to be reviewed in, like, I think, 4 categories. Originally, in the early 2000s, the vulnerability equity process was really prioritized on intelligence value first, which had a primary counterterrorism role, but it was intelligence broadly. And then it would be prioritized based on defense, really kind of military defense. It wasn't until about 2008, 2009 that we brought in that another equity that had to be balanced was the resilience of the critical infrastructure that would be impacted by the vulnerability. And the fourth is the economy and the economics around these vulnerabilities if they're exploited. And just as Nicole said, that the NotPetya destructive malicious software that used one of the NSA 0 days, it affected the global economy. You know, Maersk shipping was knocked offline for close to 6 months. They're the largest transportation vehicle by sea. And then it was also FedEx, at DHL, and air transport and other things. If that was a test to see how logistics could have been impacted for NATO, Russia really did understand how long they could delay. They could delay NATO troops from moving into Eastern Europe or to Ukraine or to other nations by at least 6 weeks. That's pretty strategic and important. So I think now the vulnerability equities process should be flipped on its head. We should actually have the vulnerability, if it affects the global economy or any part of the economy, it should be disclosed to the vendor immediately. And the vendor should prioritize fixing it. And when you look at some of the vulnerabilities that were disclosed to Microsoft, they had more than 90 days of knowledge. You should prioritize those engineers to get that done in 2 to 3 weeks. And so I look at that. So then the economy first, then the critical infrastructures and the key companies, and then defense and intelligence to be last. And to build on one of the points that Nicole said, I think there's a strategic difference between the West and the United States in particular, that the intelligence value really is for counterterrorism and for national warning, whereas the intelligence value for China is really industrial espionage and trade. And so they're using these exploits to illegally copy information, gain access, persistent access into corporations, and to advance their industries and their national economic agenda. And that's fundamentally different than what the West and the United States do.
Thank you, Melissa. Katie, back to you in case you want to add more, but also let's switch to start about solution, because we're painting this grim picture where it seems like, again, if you read Nicole's book at night, you might not sleep very well, although you will not put it down either. But how can we also prevent software from being weaponized and used aggressively? You often say that bug bounty programs, penetration testing programs are not enough to ensure the security of today's environment. So how else can government and corporation alike strengthen their cyber defenses while also, again, preventing software from being weaponized and used aggressively?
Well, stopping the weaponization idea is a nice idea, but unfortunately, as long as software executes at all, there is going to be the potential to hijack the execution of a program and make it do something that it wasn't designed to do. So the ways that major software manufacturers defend against this is basically platform level mitigations. And so, even though bounties are not the answer, one of the innovative things about the original Microsoft bug bounties is that they were the first bug bounty to look for mitigated defeat, novel ways to defeat all the defenses in the platform, and also provide a bounty award for new defensive ideas. It's unfortunate, though, that a lot of organizations just don't even have the basics. We talk about these things in terms of Microsoft, Apple, Google, and the major corporations. Facebook, is another one with billions of users worldwide that offers an attack surface. But all of these major corporations have done significant investments in cybersecurity and secure development over the years. There is a sharp cliff and a drop off of security capability once you get out of that, top tier of vendors. And unfortunately, the application ecosystem is complex enough that even if you got those major vendors doing perfect security work and fixing things, within weeks, as opposed to months or years in some cases, even if you got those top organizations fixing their software and building more secure software, you just have this long tail of other application providers and, application providers for mobile applications, for example. And this is a developer ecosystem that they're still making the same coding mistakes that every other generation of developer has made before them. One answer that folks have looked at is to invest in more secure coding frameworks, such that if you use certain coding languages, it's harder to write critical vulnerabilities into them because they have memory safety protections already built in, or they're very type safe, as they say. And it's harder to write a buffer overflow exploit for that type of language. But then there's the adoption problem. This is, again, this is a complex ecosystem of software running on operating systems, interconnected with each other, online services interconnecting with each other. And so, rather than say that there is some sort of solution and prevention out there, it's honestly more about the dental hygiene of security, the stuff that nobody wants to talk about. You've got 0 days on the sexy end, but you've really got the prevention and the building security in using a secure development lifecycle that most organizations are years away from implementing. So unfortunately, I don't think there is a technical solution to this problem, except brushing and flossing your code daily, as in performing secure development lifecycle activities from the earliest stages of the lifecycle onward, and then having a robust response mechanism for when vulnerabilities are found in your code and you have to go back and fix it. This is the state of software. And as long as humans write software, there will be flaws in code and people will be able to take advantage of them.
And the hacker seems to be always one step ahead. Well, I want to just follow up on Katie, but also shift the attention to specific concern and opportunities for the Central Europe and Eastern European region, because this event is happening on the sideline of Cybersec, specific to Central Europe and Eastern Europe this year. And so, Nicole, back to you. A lot of the hackers that you actually talked to for your book were born and raised in this region: Romania, Bulgaria, Poland. And you often said, when you speak at other events, that we need to change this incentive structure to address the growing exploitation and sale of software vulnerabilities. So how specifically could we help Central Eastern European countries to help curb the sale and exploitation of vulnerabilities in this black market, while also being better at smart defense, like Katie just described?
Well, I think at this point, Katie is one of the people who made one of those solutions work, which was bug bounties for one. She mentioned this, but the innovation that she really brought to bug bounties at Microsoft was introducing it in beta looking at code before you get it into millions of people's hands and inviting hackers to take a look at it and trying to find and mitigate those flaws before you roll it out, not just to people, but into the power grid and transportation systems. And so, what they fundamentally did was they said, there are a group of people all over the world who know that they can always make more money by selling these 0 days to governments. That will never change. And maybe we should never expect companies to try to pay top dollar or meet government prices for 0 days, because then who's going to stay inside Microsoft and say, I'll stay on salary for $200,000 a year when they know they could just walk outside the door and sell Microsoft a 0 day in its code and make millions of dollars. That just doesn't work. That creates perverse incentives. And I know that was a lot of Katie's thinking when she helped Microsoft launch their bug bounty program. How do you do this without creating perverse incentives? And so the idea is, why don't you tap into these millions of programmers all over the world who don't necessarily want to sell to a government and not really know how that 0 day is going to be used, or more importantly, who it's going to be used against, who want the reward of being able to take credit for their work, for their discovery, and bug bounties allow them to do that because they can publicize their finding and they can talk about it and get street cred for it. So in that sense, bug bounties are a real tool here, but I think we all agree that it's reactive. It's naturally reactive. Ideally, we would be writing these vulnerabilities into our code in the first place. And as Katie just mentioned, it's unrealistic to think that we're going to stop writing vulnerabilities into code. Sure, a lot of the top vendors, software vendors, have adopted secure lifecycle development approaches. But here in Silicon Valley, where I'm based, the operating MO is still very much move fast and break things. Get your app to market as quickly as you can before the competition. Get as much market share as you can, and you will win. And if there's security problems or flaws in your code, you can fix them later. So, I am now at the point where I think we're never going to solve this problem when it comes down to apps, et cetera. Although I think just, the basic hygiene that Katie alluded to is critical now. Taking inventory of what's in your networks, ripping out Microsoft XP software that can't get patched even if you wanted it to. Basically moving, unfortunately, the answer these days is moving some of your data to the cloud with vendors that do have the financial resources and budgets to build up mini intelligence agencies and track sophisticated nation state threats and patch quickly and put secure development protocols in place. But I think we're going to enter a new era here, and we're already starting to see this with the ransomware attacks on things like the Colonial Pipeline and food supply and hospitals, where I think we're going to have to ask ourselves, do we really want to keep baking vulnerable software into those kinds of systems, into critical infrastructure like pipelines, like hospitals? And I think if the answer is no, we do not, then it might be time to rip out Microsoft Windows, and Linux from those safety critical systems. And that might sound radical, but one of the interesting things that happened to me in the course of researching my book was I would interview these 0 day brokers. My last question was always, is there anything you've never been able to break into? Is there any software out there that a government wanted to break and reached out to the best Romanian hackers you knew and it just couldn't get in? And a couple times the answer was yes. There was one software company out there. It's called Green Hill Software. They're actually based in Santa Barbara, and I'm working on a story about them right now. And when I finally got in touch with the Green Hill Software people, I said, what is it about your software that these 0 day brokers and hackers couldn't break? Is there some magic algorithm? And they said, I wish I could tell you that it was magic, but what it was our first customer was the Pentagon. They asked us to write an operating system for the intercontinental missile delivery system. They didn't want something that was going to be vulnerable where we would have to patch it remotely because they worried about how that remote capability would be exploited. And so we wrote this operating system for this missile system. We went line by line by line, knowing that the end user was the Pentagon, and they needed this to be safe from the beginning. And so they just adopted this very strict mindset about how they wrote their code. I think it might be a good idea to think about ripping out software that was designed for desktop computers initially. It's not a knock on Microsoft, it's just that they developed an operating system for desktop computers, never thinking that that operating system would get bolted into the power grid and hospitals and pacemakers. I think maybe we're entering a new era where we're going to continue to see destructive cyber attacks, maybe even ransomware, on industrial systems, on ICS systems. And maybe it's time to think about ripping that software out of there and making sure that whatever we put in its place is minimalist, it's stripped down, it's vetted, and it's been looked at in beta form before it gets rolled into these systems. So that's just, on the radical edge. We have so much work to do before we get there in terms of just our cyber hygiene. And I just worry that we're already talking about a new automated world driven by AI and machine learning. And we haven't even figured out how to just take inventory of what's in our networks and how to vet our code.
Well, Nicole, this could not be a better segue back to Melissa, because these are a lot of the sound bites that she has been sounding for a long time, since I've ever known her, for sure. And Melissa, I know you have done a lot of work trying to sensitize the community to the importance of regulating software development and the software supply chain, especially in critical sector. So how should the transatlantic community, and increasingly a role for maybe Central and Eastern Europe, in approaching regulating and auditing software, especially this code that we're embedding in critical services and product? What else can these governments do to better collaborate to again begin the discussion on software supply chain security?
Well, I think that we really need to, these governments need to be thinking about tomorrow's problem, which is the Internet of Things, the industrial Internet of Things, and 5G networks. And the more connected devices that we have that communicate and are hyper permissioned to other devices are going to create more and more vulnerabilities to our critical infrastructures. Right now, while there is some overarching guidance from the EU and from the Commission, each country gets to do their own approach to what they think are the minimum standards, what do they think are the critical suppliers. And I think there's not enough being done for really recognizing how much vulnerability we are embedding or baking into our core infrastructures right now on our hyper digital transformation mode. We're trying to modernize these infrastructures. We're trying to connect the 3 Cs with north-south routes. We're trying to get a better security in the Bucharest 9, or those who are along the Black Sea and the Adriatic Sea. We need to really think about how do we incentivize these device manufacturers, the network providers, and the companies to really think about segmentation of the networks, resilience of the infrastructures, and actually fielding quality well-engineered products that have been tested at the beta level, which is what Nicole and Katie have advocated. And I agree. We have allowed minimum viable products that are full of vulnerabilities, flood the market, and make us all more vulnerable. So it's the responsibility of our governments, of these corporations, to really sit down and think about, what do we want? How are we going to buy down the risk over the next 5 to 10 years, and not make it exponential risk to each of our countries and to the whole region?
Thank you. I know they all agree with you. I know we were given a couple extra minutes since we started late. And Katie, I want to go back to you because I would be remiss if I didn't ask again about opportunities for this region. The other piece of the story is building talent, the right workforce. And the and Eastern European region has great potential when it comes to ICT talent. What are some of the other recommendations you would offer to government in the region to harness that potential, to develop more talent locally, and to join other efforts that are trying to make cyberspace a safer place to conduct business and to really reap the benefits of digitization?
Well, thank you for that question. It may sound counterintuitive, but I think governments, in order to foster and develop domestic talent in each of their countries, I think they need to take a good look at some of their anti hacking laws and cybercrime laws and revise them such that there is true legal safe harbor in place for security researchers. Not only that, but I do think governments do need to start vulnerability disclosure programs, not necessarily bug bounty programs. They're probably not ready for that kind of traffic, but the ability to find the right point of contact to tell your government if you found a security hole, that's not only helping the infrastructure of your country, but it's helping your government identify you as a potential talent to be cultivated and developed. And the biggest chill factor to any cybersecurity person just starting out is worrying about their legal risk. If they find a vulnerability, is it safe for them to report it to a government or to a company, or will they be threatened legally, sued, or worse, even arrested for what they've done? And I think that, growing up as a hacker in the United States, right as the first Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the first laws against hacking were being put in place because of fear due to the movie War Games, we're long overdue for revising some of these laws. And I think that is one of the best ways that we can develop cybersecurity talent, is providing true safe harbor carve-outs in laws. And, I've also worked in international export control and had to work to provide exemption language for vulnerability disclosure and incident response because those regulations were too strict, and we would not have the capability to respond to cyber attacks as quickly, nor discover new vulnerabilities and try and prevent those attacks in the future when those restrictions are too chilling for cybersecurity researchers and emerging talent to come forth.
Thank you, and we all owe you a huge deal of gratitude for including that language in the Wassenaar Agreement. So before we wrap up our panel discussion, I wanted to have a rapid round to ask all of you, what are other recommendations, again, you would offer governments in the region, either individually or as part of the many groups that have actually been born and they're expanding in the past few years in the regions, whether it's the 3C initiative or the Bucharest 9 that Melissa mentioned, the Visegrad group of 4, so that they can build stronger cyber resilience together, better coordinate their effort, and continue to support the expansion of Europe and the stability of NATO. Any one of you, just jump in.
Well, I think the best thing for the region to do is to actually share information, to talk about what are the regional priorities, to invest and use the European funds for the digitization to actually advance the region, and work on incentives for lessons learned, incentives on, where some of the key companies are developing unique technologies, driving the innovation, working on the research and development. There's a new center in Romania that is supposed to be championing this on behalf of all of Europe. Slovenia has prioritized cybersecurity and artificial intelligence as they are moving into their presidency of the EU. So we need to think about different and unique ways where the region could actually share information, cooperate, coordinate, and drive for a better infrastructure and digital future.
Thank you. And Nicole, Katie, any final thoughts? This was the highlight of the conference today, so I'm sure they're all waiting for your final thoughts and recommendation before they go have a drinks and we can go have a lunch.
I'll let Katie have the last word on this one. I would just say it's some of the least sexy things. It is interesting to talk about 0 days, and it is getting more relevant now that we're seeing what China is doing. And just in the last few days, we've seen Russia talk about how they want to migrate away from Western technology and develop their own technology without realizing that makes the vulnerability equities process a lot easier when we think that the only people who could be harmed by holding on to a 0 day is Russia, not United States citizens. But putting the 0 day discussions aside for a minute, it really is the least sexy stuff. It's trying to raise the bar to make sure that you're cutting out the unnecessary risk. It's ripping out old legacy software. It's making sure that multi-factor authentication is installed. It's taking constant inventory of critical networks to make sure there are no old employee accounts lingering around without multi-factor authentication installed. It's segmenting your most critical data, whatever that is, from the rest of your networks. It's zero trust. And it's the code, buzzword du jour these days is SBOM, the software bill of materials. It's understanding what is in your software, how is it vetted, what's the software making its way into your software, how is that vetted, and really kind of this minimalist approach to your networks, because we all know that complexity is the enemy of good security. So it's basically just taking stock of everything that's in your network and asking yourself, do I really need this? Is this secure, or is this just introducing more risk? And if you do that, you're going to be way better off than 80% of the world right now. It's just doing the basic things, and most of us are guilty of not doing the basic things. Here in the United States, we still think of ourselves as on an island separated by two oceans, and that's just not the case in our digital era. And where you are, you have the advantage of knowing that there are risks coming from some of your closest neighbors, and you can operate with that threat model in mind. It doesn't have to be a hypothetical. We're still trying to figure that out here, and it's really a cultural problem here that you might not have where you are, and I think you should use that to your advantage.
Thank you. And Katie, any final words for the governments and talent in the region?
So I think folks in the region need to pay attention to their emerging talent pools, not just in hacking, which is the sexy side of things, and we do keep talking about that. And I myself, as a hacker, certainly have enjoyed, the fact that people are so enamored with our abilities. But it's the folks who are in prevention and IT infrastructure, and the folks who have to do patch management. Those are our real heroes in cybersecurity. And so what governments around the world and in the region can do is provide more training and programs to train the receiving end of vulnerability maintenance and vulnerability, prevention. And I think that more money into university programs that teach practical hacking as a means of illustrating how easy it is to hack if you don't have the proper defenses. And that really comes down to defense in depth. A lot of what Nicole was saying is absolutely true. Simplifying and nailing the basics is important, but you also need to provide incentives for new technology to incorporate security from the ground up. And I'll just finish with a short story. The popular audio-only application called Clubhouse, yet another unicorn startup from Silicon Valley. I was able to hack that as a retired hacker and turn that app into a surveillance app where you could silently surveil in rooms invisibly or disrupt them invisibly. And it's a $1 billion valuation company that can be hacked by a retired hacker. We've got an incentive problem on the new technology end as well. And I think that governments would do well to pay attention to that and provide a little bit more regulatory guidance to these companies that are quickly on the rise, becoming more significant, and in the future will be so embedded in our lives like the rest of social media that it would be very difficult for any government to defend against attacks on these new applications. So building more defenders, supporting more defenders, not being completely enamored with the hacking side all the time, although it is sexy, and building incentives in for new startups to build security in from the ground up before they become wildly popular would be my advice to this and any region.
Thank you. We couldn't agree more. And with that, I would like to thank all our panelists for this fascinating, just slightly scary discussion. This has been great. It was so fun to see all of you. Katie, actually, last time I saw you was at Cybersec 3 years ago. So I hope we can resume our in-person meeting soon. I also want to thank the Kosciuszko Institute for allowing me to moderate this panel. And I want to join everybody in thanking you. I'm sure if we were all together in person, there would be a loud applause at this point. And I will hand the floor back to Cybersec for final goodbyes for today. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.